currency. Matthias pressed the fold of one of Jasper's pamphlets into Edda's hands. If you were to show this an expert, someone not in the scriptorium, not of our institutions, could they prove it false? Edda's hand caressed the paper as if testing a pulse. One can show its falsity by showing that the ink is recent, or by matching the seal to a known die, or by tracing paper's purchase to a shop rack. But who has the patience? The man in the tavern, the woman holding a name she wants something she can cling to like a rope when the wind comes. This is not only a technical problem, it is social. People want immediate reckonings, and the Chancellor will seize it as evidence the movement is fraudulent. He will outlaw publications, increase search of couriers he already has in whispers, she said. Galen spoke of new lists, a purge of rogue scribes. You know what that means. Those who might have testified will be cowed into silence. Captain Ryan came then, appearing like a landmass in the flow of the quay. He had been patrolling the fringes. Dusk frayed his uniform at the edges. He looked at the pamphlet and his features pinched. If the Chancellor moves openly now, he will gain an excuse to arrest people we cannot afford to lose, he said. If he moves, the men who remember may go down to the street and burn something. The city is not a careful library. The city will take its own punishments. Matthias thought of the ledger's names, of unmarked graves that smelled of clay and reluctance, of the little rituals Ryan had enacted in the cemetery, clearing a stone, whispering a name. He thought of Mara in the tavern, of the woman's tears as she read a differing pamphlet and then folded it away. Evidence dissolved into argument. The ledger would not be rescued by facts alone. The night compressed around them, and Matthias felt the cold certainty, no, the cold possibility that would haunt him henceforward, that proof could be rendered useless if the public's faith in documents was destroyed. Jasper's forgeries were not simply instruments of deceit. They were an assault upon the very idea that past acts could be known. If truth was converted into a marketable compound, then memory itself was for sale. He could imagine already the Chancellor's rejoinder, "We cannot allow these pamphlets to set the city aflame." The refrain would be order, the remedy would be repression. And in that repression the ledger's names might still be erased. Not by purposeful redaction, but by a cynical officialdom that found it easier to clamp down on all publication and thereby remove every trace, authentic or counterfeit. Matthias slept badly that night. Sleep for him had always been an organized thing, a small well of recovery to be visited between tasks. Now it was a shore pelted by small, persistent waves of worry. He thought, resistingly, of a plan they had been shaping, a marginal appendix, a network of trusted copies slipped to convents and select markets. Jasper's forgeries had not yet shown they could match the exact handwriting of the scriptorium master or the die of the proper seal, but they had, by psychological effect, already begun to undermine the ledger's public standing. The plan would have to be faster, more meticulous, and more cunning than they had imagined. When dawn drew a pall around the tiles and the first traders set their stands, Matthias rose with a particular kind of resolve. He would not let the ledger be buried beneath a flood of plausible lies without a fight that used the same citycraft that had made the lies persuasive. He did not know how yet. He only knew the trajectory of necessity. If he could not keep the past untarnished, he would have to alter the present in which the past lived. The city woke as if nothing were wrong, and that was the terrifying vanity of it. Market voices took up the pamphlets and argued their way into the day's commerce. Thomas whispered that couriers had been seen with Jasper's leaflets tied into their bundles. Someone had hung a copy on the scriptorium gate with the pins mortised to look like a public proclamation. Mara's supporters promised protests that would be orderly and decisive. Those promises would either be a new breath of memory or a catalyst for a state answer that would scorch history more cleanly than any pen. The Chancellor would watch and calibrate. The currency of lies had vaulted into circulation, and the city would now bid upon it. Matthias walked to the scriptorium in a world that looked the same as it had yesterday, but felt different in the hands. The ledger in his satchel was warm, as if it had been living in the skin of the earth. He thought then of the small acts they could do marginalia placed in official copies, the careful distribution of authenticated transcripts to known and trusted hands, the convening of witnesses in places beyond the reach of palace lists. He thought of Jasper's rueful smile, of Edda's tight face, of Ryan's hands that had once held a musket and now tended graves. The work of preserving the ledger would be a kind of warfare without armies, requiring cunning and patient violence against inertia. He climbed the scriptorium steps and felt the press of time like a hand closing on a thin rope. The Chronicle's sanctification was still weeks away, but the contest over legibility had begun now in the small, dirty amphitheater of the market and the hush of private workshops. He had hoped once that truth alone could clear the air. But this morning he understood that in a city rebuilt from ash, where memory had been a resource to be allocated, truth could not stand alone. It would have to be made plausible, believable, circulated and guarded, as if it were a coin. And like coins, truths could be counterfeited. They had to be kept in trusted hands. He entered the scriptorium with that thought lodged in his chest, and a new and urgent question at the back of his mind. If they could forge evidence that discredited the ledger, could they also forge evidence that proved the ledger? The notion was a bitter one, as if he were to use the Chancellor's own language of substitution to beat the Chancellor at his game. Yet the choice came down to whether he would preserve a brittle peace at the cost of the betrayed names, or weaponize the same materials of deceit to ensure those names would not be erased. It was a thought that felt like a wound and an instrument at once. Outside in the market, a hawker folded his pamphlets and called out his wares. Inside in the scriptorium, the ink waited, patient as a grave. Matthias sat at his desk and opened the ledger. The names watched him, small and dark and stubborn. He ran his finger down the line and, for the first time since he had first held that misfiled volume, he felt the arithmetic of responsibility in his own fingers. The currency of lies had entered into general circulation. The account would demand balance, one way or the other. He set his hand to work. Matthias had thought of leaks as paper storms, a single relentless gust to reveal what lay beneath the settled dust. In the quiet of the scriptorium his imagination had been kinder to the act names set free like birds, the city catching and keeping them. Collective memory rearranging itself around the new knowledge. The reality arrived in a single, small, suffocating failure. It began as many misadventures do, with an apothecary's door left unlatched. Thomas had been the one to insist on the place. He came with his usual air of half-exhausted urgency, bundles underarm, a half-smile that could mean business or rumor. "Silas will do it," he said, naming the apothecary as if the name alone made a sanctuary of the shop, as if a man who ground herbs and boiled syrups would be less likely to betray a folded paper than a tavern cuss. The back room of the apothecary was low-ceilinged, lit by a single oil lamp that breathed its yellow into jars of dried leaves and powders. The dominant smell was thyme and something floral, an undernote of vinegar and old wood. Thomas laid a damp, palm-sized parcel on the table, one that did not belong to the apothecary's trade. It was a careful fold of vellum, a few copies, perhaps, of a list that could be copied by hand and spread in the market with an economy of whispers. Matthias watched with the practiced vigilance of a man who had been trained to look for the telltale stains of error. The tiny smudge that told of a misapplied ink or an accidental omission. Here the telltale was different hands that shook, a voice that didn't settle. He had brought, along with the folded paper, a small packet of notes, lists of names, addresses where families still lived, dates that matched the ledger's entries. The plan was simple. Use local hands to produce loose sheets overnight, scatter them among the stalls and bakeries in the morning, and let the city read and remember. It was not an immediate proclamation, only a rip, a test. Silas, the apothecary, held the paper like lit coal. "It will burn their tongues," he said, meaning more than heat. His voice was the dry rasp of someone accustomed to making bitter things palatable. "If the guards come, they will not merely stomp on words. They'll stamp on faces." That warning should have been the place to stop. But hope has an anatomy of its own. It does not submit to counsel. Mara had been meeting families in alleys and larders for months, whispering names like a prayer. She had learned to fold outrage into the cadence of a market seller's pitch so that gossip and grief might slide, disguised as commerce, from palm to palm. The plan appealed to her because it placed the ledger where the city would touch it unawares, where ordinary hands would carry it home and read it to children who had been taught to speak of a clean victory. Night deepened, and the lamp flared between their faces. Ryan remained at the edge, a shadow in the doorway, his uniform's lines unforgiving even in that intimacy. He had insisted on being present neither for secrecy nor for proof, but because what he had learned of betrayal gnawed in him a way orders and medals never would. "We must time it with the market," he said, speaking like a man who had once moved armies and who now worked in breaths. Before the Chancellor's patrols coiled tight for the day, they left the back room with the paper pressed into the folds of Thomas' satchel. The courier, who had always moved through alleys with an air of unimportance, was meant to be invisible, a shadow between bread and bones. "Drop at the herb stall by dawn," Matthias said, and felt his voice wobble under the weight of the name he had chosen. He wondered if names could be given back so easily to the world, if a list of dead men, of men traded away like cattle, could ever be disentangled from the bodies still warm in their graves. The first misstep was nothing spectacular. Thomas' feet found a side street where a patrol sometimes waited for the hour of dawn. He took the alley because it promised a shortcut. A man in a plain cloak stepped out from behind a leaning cart and blocked his path, a bluntness in the movement that jarred Thomas. The man asked for his bag. Thomas laughed, a surprise that looked like fear. A third hand slid from the cloak and took the satchel. Someone else, two more shadows, closed the street behind them. Matthias, who had not meant to follow, found himself at the mouth of the alley. He had meant to go home, to sleep for an hour and wake with courage. But the city's geometry has a sly way of dragging those who make plans. He heard the exchange, a small, dry sound of a wallet thrown into a palm, a low voice that spoke too assuredly of official business. Then a shout and the arrival of boots above the stone. Patrolmen spread like a net, and by the time he reached the place, an apothecary's satchel had gone from a thing of hope to heaps of torn paper and a watchman's boot on a scrap. Thomas' face was open and hollow with confusion. He swallowed like a man learning a new religion. The leak collapsed not with intrigue, but with a banal theft and the neat efficiency of the patrols. Someone in the cloak had been watching the courier and had known where the papers would be. From the first moment of the interception, the state's machinery smelled the breach. Word moved long before the paper could, a courier's mouth, a stallholder's glance, a frightened child's question. The market, which should have been only a place of trade, became an arena of rumor. By dawn, the stall where the lists would have been scattered was empty save for a torn cloth and a knife stuck in a board. Mara, who had expected a gentle contagion of memory, found herself facing a shriek of violence. The rally she had planned to use the leak as a trimmer for no more than a reading of names and the laying of small tokens at an empty cart was redefined by others. Palace guards, who at first came in pairs to question stallholders, returned in a phalanx that pressed forward like a black tide. They declared the gathering seditious. A woman shrieked when a man in a black cuff pushed her to the ground. The sound compounded into a chorus. Men with the Chronicle's emblem stamped on their shoulders moved with a practiced brutality. Matthias got there late and in pieces. He had come by back alleys, taking comfort from shadow, but the market itself felt two loud shouts, The distressing metallic clatter of a wooden crate struck for crowd control, the smell of spices overlaid with the coppery tang of blood. He saw Mara first on a crate, arms flung wide as if balancing a world that had tipped. Her voice always too sharp for the words she held cut through the chaos. "They gave our names a price," she cried. "They called them ledger entries. Now we call them by name." A man in a robe and a helmet, apparently a magistrate or an official, stepped forward and read something in a tone meant to sound exhausted but decisive. "The gathering is unlawful. These actions amount to sedition and the incitement of insurrection. By decree of the Chancellor, all those who foment unrest will be arrested. By punishment, stability is restored. Stability is restored." The phrase landed like a cudgel. Matthias watched as people who had simply come to remember were ripped out of the crowd. He saw a baker clutching a folded paper that bore a name, and then fling it to the stone as a guard's fist angled toward his jaw. He saw a child who had found a scrap on the ground pinched between two soldiers and then struck down for the inability to answer a leader's question. Old Watchman Bird tried to step into the fray and was shoved aside. He turned his head and spat on a soldier's boot with the little grace left him. A skirmish of commotion became something worse. Someone threw a stone, no one remembered who, and it did not matter, and the guards answered with a line of doubled clubs. Hands reached for anyone they could claim as ringleaders. The tactic was simple: make fear real so that you can argue you act only in self-defense. Ryan moved like a man unlearning the sensibility of restraint. He shoved his weight into the crowd, pulling a woman away from a swinging arm, his face a tight harness of muscle and grief. Where he moved, young men from the streets hesitated. They saw in him an old authority and followed, a small, desperate pursuit of order within chaos. The real cruelty of the morning was its improvisation. A group of men were seized and dragged to the side of the square, two at a time, their cloaks slipping from their shoulders. The act itself was banal, knotting ropes, prodding with boots, but what made it monstrous was the publicness. The authorities wanted images, bodies on the ground, the state in control. They were not merely arresting. They were demonstrating the price of disorder. Matthias' stomach turned as he saw someone he half knew, one of the families whose name was now lived in a trembling whisper, pulled down by two guards. The man's face was a book of long fatigue. He had been found at a stall with a scrap of paper in his hand. They dragged him out and forced him to his knees. One guard hauled open his collar and demanded the names of his companions. He refused. The guard's knife flashed, not to kill but to scare. The blade drew a shallow crescent of blood across the man's brow. He fell back. The crowd began to chant, not in favor but in fear. A young woman tried to ram a wooden crate between the guards and the kneeling man and was struck down. At the edge of the square, a small gang of men, likely organized by those who sought to use any disturbance to settle old scores, began to throw punches. In the resulting muddle, a body fell and did not get back up. The first body was not dramatic. It was a man curled like a knot, his jacket stained with a slow darkening at the chest. A soldier put his boot on the man's shoulder to press his head into the cobbles. Another soldier realized there was a second body, limp and pale. Word moved through the crowd like a disease. The casualties were piling. Someone shrieked that men were being dragged to the precinct. Mothers gathered their children. Some fled and others clung to the ground as if the earth itself could keep them safe. Matthias had never seen a body move with such smallness. He had catalogued dates and deaths as numbers on a ledger, but had tried to keep distance, gentle gloves to ward off the intimacy of loss. Now the bodies were immediate and smelling of iron and earth. The city smelled of panic and oil and 1,000 curious human things. He felt in his chest the raw, animal reaction to a wound, that small heap of grief that made lungs behave like bellows and vision tunnel. The state did not waste the image. By midday the Chancellor had a proclamation ready. Varen's face was severe and composed in the public square. His voice, recorded and issued in the basilica, claimed the city's safety had been threatened by a seditious conspiracy. He spoke of traitors who ginned up disorder in order to destabilize the crown. He framed the dead not as victims of state force but as evidence of a plot theirs turned to treachery. "We act to prevent chaos," he told the city. "We will not permit those who would set memory loose to ignite violence." The phrase returned, polished, "prevent chaos." Matthias listened to the words and felt them in his mouth like ash. The state had reversed the moral geometry. The one who named the dead could be made to appear the one who had caused their deaths. The logic was brutal and elegant. If the memory that had been suppressed now caused unrest, then the suppression had been justified, in part, by the unrest itself. Varon's calculus was a loop: silence to prevent chaos, and then use any chaos to enforce further silence. He thought of the ledgers' names of the ledgers, list that could have changed the morning's arc. What had been stolen from Thomas, had it been printed, would have carried with it a crowded truth, a record of commerce and betrayal. Instead, the theft left the city with curiosity and no context, a rumor without an anchor. The absence had become a vacuum into which the state's story poured. Matthias felt guilt like cold water poured over his head. It was not merely the knowledge that his act had not gone as intended, but that his half-truth, his attempt to thread revelation through the market, without the weight of the ledger's full provenance, had provided the perfect standing for the Chancellor's argument. If the list had reached more hands intact, the story might have had witnesses who could speak to provenance: Sister Unwin, Edda, Ryan. The careful signatures and seals that attested to authenticity. As it was, a theft and a scattering provided all the state needed to call it forgery and sedition. Jasper, who had been somewhere on the periphery, came to Matthias like a man who had smelled the fury in the wind and wanted to trade in it. He moved with the practiced shamelessness of one who had spent years in the back rooms of the scriptorium, erasing and reforging names for coin. "They will sell this as counterfeit," he said, and in his mouth the words were a transaction. "The Chancellor will shout for authenticity. He will hire his own forgers and say, 'See, men would lie to tear down the work of state.'" Ryan grabbed Matthias' shoulder with a grip that hurt. The captain's jaw had the look of a man who had been kept from falling by habit alone. "We have to get people out of their houses," he said. "There will be roundups. They use this as pretext. You know how they work. You were there when the master told you how to erase. You know where they look." Matthias swallowed, and the taste of iron filled his mouth. He could picture the files that were marked for scrutiny, the names that would be cross-referenced and then excised. He could picture his family being asked a question about loyalty and having to answer with silence. His mother, who could not bear scandal. His cousins, who had cobbled a life out of quiet. He felt the world narrow into a sickening calculus, truth as a blade that could cut the hand that holds it. The day's end brought no tidy resolution. The city slept in a precarious hush, the market reduced to ragged cloths and the echo of boots. Fires burned where stalls had been overturned. Patrols ran a new, low beat through neighborhoods, knocking on doors with the brass and authority of a state that had decided its story and would not relinquish it. The Chancellor's decree lay on every table like an ultimatum, and in taverns men who a week ago had argued of lineage and law now spoke with the tone of survivors. Matthias returned to the scriptorium with grime under his nails and a mind thick with images. He had seen a body dragged. He had seen a man kneel and be cut. The city had rearranged itself around a new truth. He sat by a curtained desk and took up a clean sheet, his hand moving without intention to copy words he had committed to memory. The ink felt treacherous beneath his fingers. Edda arrived with the dusk. She had the look of one who wears secrecy like a second skin, eyes without shine, a hand that steadied a pack of stolen books. She did not ask how or why. She simply set down a small, sealed packet on Matthias' desk and after a pause said, "They will charge forgery. They always do." We need provenance more than scraps. We need witnesses who cannot be easily discredited. Matthias had no answer because the truth of the morning pulled at him like a wound. He had meant to save the names from total erasure. Instead, he had given the state an armband of justification. He had hoped that a ripple could be managed. Instead, the wave had been stepped on and turned into an instrument. That night he dreamed of pages flapping in a wind that smelled of smoke. Names fell like ash. He woke with a sheet of paper clutched in his hand, as if the ledger had been a living thing and would strangle him if he didn't hold it. The city had been given a story that claimed the martyrs were the instigators. Matthias understood, with a growing, nauseous certainty, that the moral arithmetic of Revelation had variables he had not accounted for, the state's hunger for images, the ease with which absence becomes instrument, and the terrible speed at which a half-truth can be converted into a weapon. Outside, in the lanes that led to his family's dwelling, lamps flickered as men came to ask awkward questions. It was not yet the time of arrests. At the doors, Varron wanted confession first, spectacle later, but the city's underclock had been set shifting. The failings of the leak would not be confined to the market square. Matthias now knew the ledger could not be let loose in fragments. If it were to be made public, it must be whole, with witnesses and seals, with Sister Anwen's corroboration and Ryan's testimony, and the careful marginalia that Edda could craft. Anything less and the state would continue to twist. He thought of the cost. Not only the lives lost that morning, but the lives that might fall if they persisted unwisely. He thought of his family's shelter, the small mercies of food and hearth they had stitched together from the rubble, and he imagined those comforts, gone, replaced by the state's hands and questions. At the end of the day, the question landed heavy and unavoidable between them: is truth worth the blood it might draw? The ledger's names wrenched in his mind like a litany, and guilt spread across him like an oil stain. In the scriptorium, a candle guttered. Outside, the chancellor's proclamations read like law. Inside, men and women who had tried to restore the vanished names sat with words unspoken, hands that had touched parchment now feeling only the ghost of ink. The failed leak was not merely a failure of procedure. It was a moral pivot that forced Matthias to see his own agency and its limits. He had imagined himself an instrument of memory, an impartial scribe moving lightly between errors. He now understood that instruments are always hands, and hands can be used to heal or to crush. When he closed his eyes, the memory of the kneeling man stayed with him. The man's lips had been blue. When they moved, they whispered a single name that Matthias recognized, a name that had been in the ledger and that now hung between the earth and the city like a thing waiting to be called. The night offered no counsel, only the continuing small noises of a city that would either harden or split. Matthias slept in brief shards and awoke before dawn with the scribe's compulsion to act. He realized then, with the tidy cruelty of insight, that whatever plan he and the others made next would have to be less like a whisper and more like a covenant. Deliberate, defensible, and so whole that the chancellor's hand could not spin it into treason. The failed leak had taught him the cost of a half-truth. It had also taught him the necessity of craftsmanship, copies, witnesses, carefully seamed provenance. He knew this much at least, that the ledger would not survive in scattered scraps. The name that had whispered in the kneeling man's mouth would not be satisfied with revenge or silence alone. It would demand, in its own patient way, an accounting. Matthias felt the weight of that summons, and with it, the coldness of a future that required not only courage but also precision. The city carried on, as cities must. The chancellor fortified his narrative, patrols walked a little taller, families moved quieter. On some tables people folded proclamations and offered them prayer. On others men and women whispered of conspiracy. And Matthias, who had once thought his duty was to make the chronicle tidy, woke to a fuller, ruinous duty, to make the truth unshackable, or else to accept that it would be buried again beneath the state's tidy lies. He would have to choose which of those fates he could live with. Outside, a bell tolled the hour. In the courtyard, a lantern guttered and went out. The city